One day, you'll understand why you stopped.
Jacob, did you help an elderly woman during the storm? I'll be home before supper.
Thank you for coming, Jacob. I told you we'd meet again.
The day I met that old woman, I thought I was simply sharing a meal with someone who had nowhere else to go. I had no idea that 3 weeks later, a sheriff would pull into my driveway because of her. The rain had started just before sunset, not the kind that floods rivers or tears roofs apart, just a cold, steady drizzle that soaks through your clothes until you stop noticing how wet you are. I was driving home after selling a load of hay in town, thinking about the bills waiting on my kitchen table, and wondering how I was going to stretch the little money I had until the next month. Then I saw her. She was sitting alone beside the dirt road, wrapped in a worn-out coat that had probably seen better days decades ago. An old backpack rested beside her. Her boots were covered in mud. She looked exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying far more than just a heavy bag. Several cars passed without slowing down. One pickup splashed muddy water across the shoulder as it sped by. Nobody even rolled down a window to ask if she was all right. I pulled my truck onto the side of the road. When I walked over, she tried to smile. "I'll be fine," she said softly, but her trembling hands told a different story. I asked if she'd eaten. She hesitated before quietly admitting she couldn't remember her last proper meal. I walked back to my truck, grabbed the sandwiches Emma and I hadn't eaten, a thermos of hot coffee, and the wool blanket I always kept behind the seat for cold nights. She looked at the food as though I had handed her something priceless. "Thank you," she whispered. As darkness settled over the Texas countryside, I couldn't leave her there. An old hay barn sat less than a mile from my ranch. It wasn't much, but it was dry, protected from the wind, and far safer than spending the night beside the road. I helped her inside, spread the blanket over a stack of clean hay, and made sure she had enough food and water to get through the night. Before I left, she looked at me with eyes that seemed far older than the years on her face. Then she smiled, a peaceful, almost knowing smile. "One day," she paused, "you'll understand why you stopped." I thought she was simply thanking me. I wished her a good night, climbed back into my truck, and drove home, believing I'd probably never see her again. 3 weeks later, a sheriff's patrol car pulled into my driveway, and suddenly, I realized that rainy evening had been the beginning of a story I never could have imagined. My name is Jacob Miller. I'm 42 years old, and I've spent almost my entire life working beneath the wide Texas sky. I'm a cowboy, not the kind who chases glory or dreams about becoming rich. Just a man trying to keep a small ranch alive while raising the most important person in my world. My daughter, Emma, she's 8 years old, and if kindness had a face, it would probably look a lot like hers. Emma loves horses more than anything. She knows each one on our ranch by name, talks to them as if they understand every word, and somehow manages to calm even the most stubborn colt with nothing more than a gentle voice and a handful of carrots. But what makes me proud isn't how well she rides. It's the way she treats people. If someone drops a bag of feed, she's the first to help pick it up. If a neighbor's dog wanders onto our property, she makes sure it goes home safely. If she sees someone sitting alone at church, she'll walk over and introduce herself before anyone else does. I like to think she got that from her mother. Life on our ranch has never been easy. The barn is old. The fences always seem to need another repair. The tractor breaks down at the worst possible moments. Some months after paying for feed, fuel and veterinary bills. I honestly don't know how the numbers manage to work out, but somehow they always do. Not because I'm lucky, because giving up has never been an option. After Sarah died, I realized Emma was looking to me for everything, not just as her father, as the person who would teach her what kind of human being she should become. That responsibility has always mattered more to me than money. Sarah understood that better than anyone. She believed the world became a little better every time someone chose kindness over convenience. The night before she passed away, she held my hand and smiled with a peace I'll never forget. Then she whispered something that has stayed with me every single day since. Never ignore someone just because everyone else does. At the time, I thought she was simply giving me one last piece of advice. Years later, I realized she was giving me a way to live. Whenever I saw someone stranded on the side of the road, I stopped. Whenever an elderly neighbor needed help repairing a fence, I helped. Whenever someone was hungry, if I had food, I shared it. Not because I expected anything in return, because I couldn't imagine looking Emma in the eyes after driving past someone who needed help. Children learn far more from what we do than from what we say. That's exactly why I stopped for that elderly woman sitting alone in the rain. To me, she wasn't a homeless stranger. She was simply another human being having the worst day of her life. I gave her a meal, a blanket, a dry place to sleep. Then I drove home believing that was the end of our story. Days passed, then weeks. Life returned to its usual rhythm of early mornings, long hours, and endless work around the ranch. I never saw that woman again. Eventually, I assumed she had simply continued her journey. I had no way of knowing that somewhere out there, she hadn't forgotten the cowboy who stopped when everyone else kept driving. 3 weeks passed, and life settled back into its usual routine. The rainstorm became just another memory. Every morning I woke before sunrise, fed the horses, checked the fences, and worked until my hands were sore enough to remind me I'd earned my sleep. The old woman never crossed my mind as someone I would see again. I simply hoped she had found a safer place to stay. Then one quiet Tuesday morning, everything changed. Emma and I were repairing a section of fence near the front pasture when I heard the sound of tires crunching over the gravel driveway. At first I assumed it was one of the neighbors, maybe someone looking for help with a horse, maybe another delivery. But when I looked up, I saw a sheriff's patrol car slowly approaching the house. My stomach tightened immediately. The vehicle stopped beside the porch. The engine went silent. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then the driver's door opened. Sheriff Daniel Harper stepped out, adjusted his hat, and walked calmly toward us. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't angry either. His expression was impossible to read. Emma looked at me. "Dad." I rested a hand on her shoulder. "It's probably nothing." Truthfully, I wasn't so sure. I walked over to meet him before he reached the porch. "Morning, Sheriff." He nodded politely. "Jacob." There was a brief silence. Then he looked directly at me. "I need to ask you something." "Of course." He took a small notebook from his pocket. "Did you help an older homeless woman about 3 weeks ago?" For a moment I didn't answer, not because I wanted to hide anything, because I couldn't understand why he was asking. Finally, I nodded. "Yes." I found her beside the road during the storm. I gave her something to eat, a blanket, and a dry place to spend the night. The sheriff quietly closed his notebook. "I thought so." Those 3 words made my heart beat a little faster. I searched his face for some clue. Had something happened to her? Was she hurt? Had someone accused me of something? I asked the question that had already formed in my mind. "Is she all right?" He hesitated. "I can't explain here." That answer only made everything worse. Instead, he looked toward his patrol car. "I need you to come with me." "Where?" "You'll understand when we get there." I glanced toward Emma. She had stopped working completely. The hammer rested forgotten beside the fence post. She walked over slowly, trying to read the sheriff's expression just as I had. "Is my dad in trouble?" Sheriff Harper knelt slightly so he could speak to her at eye level. "No one's saying that." It wasn't an answer. Emma looked back at me. Her eyes were filled with worry. I forced a smile I didn't really feel. "It's going to be okay." She nodded, but I could tell she didn't believe it. Honestly, neither did I. I asked our neighbor, Mr. Collins, to stay with Emma until I returned. Before climbing into the patrol car, I looked back one last time. Emma was standing on the porch, hugging the wooden fence with both hands, watching me leave. The drive into town felt longer than usual. The sheriff barely spoke. Every question I asked was answered the same way. "You'll understand soon." The silence inside that patrol car became almost unbearable. I replayed that rainy evening over and over in my mind. Had I missed something? Had I unknowingly broken the law? Had the old woman gotten hurt after I left her? The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became of one thing. Somehow, the simple act of helping a stranger had turned into a problem I never saw coming. Sheriff Harper drove for nearly 40 minutes without telling me where we were going. We finally pulled into the driveway of a large ranch on the outskirts of the county. At first, I didn't recognize the place. Then I noticed the familiar white fences, the sprawling pastures, the stone entrance. Whitmore Ranch. Before I had time to ask another question, Eleanor Whitmore stepped out of the front porch. The moment she saw me, she smiled with obvious relief. "Thank you for coming, Jacob." I looked from her to the sheriff. I'd really appreciate it if someone told me what's going on. Sheriff Harper simply nodded toward the main house. "Come inside." The old woman I had helped 3 weeks earlier was sitting beside a fireplace, wrapped in a clean blanket with a cup of hot tea resting in her hands. She looked completely different, not because of expensive clothes or jewelry, because she finally looked rested, healthy. When she saw me, she smiled exactly the same way she had that rainy night inside the old hay barn. "I told you we'd meet again." I couldn't hide my surprise. "You knew this would happen." She chuckled softly. I hoped it would. I looked toward Eleanor, still searching for answers. She gently placed a hand on the elderly woman's shoulder. "Jacob, I'd like you to meet Margaret Dawson." The name meant nothing to me. Seeing my confusion, Eleanor continued. "When I was a little girl, she and my father were close friends." I frowned. I thought she was homeless. Margaret smiled kindly. Most people do. She slowly set her teacup on the table before speaking again. "My husband and I owned thousands of acres many years ago. We built a successful cattle operation. We helped schools, churches, families during difficult times." Her voice remained calm. "Then my husband passed away." She paused for a moment. "Not long afterward. I trusted the wrong people. Fraud, false investments, forged documents. Within only a few years, almost everything she had spent a lifetime building disappeared. She wasn't left completely without money, but she lost the life she had known. The ranch, the business, the security." After a long silence, she looked directly at me. Something else disappeared, too. My faith in people. She admitted that after losing so much to greed, she began traveling quietly from town to town. She wore simple clothes, carried only a backpack, never revealed her name. She wanted to answer one question. Was genuine kindness still alive? Or had the world become a place where everyone expected something in return? I've met hundreds of people. Some looked away. Some pretended not to see me. Some offered advice, but very few offered help. She smiled. You stopped. I lowered my eyes. I only gave you a sandwich. You gave me dignity. Those words stayed with me. Eleanor quietly added another piece of the story. When my father learned what happened to Margaret years ago, he never stopped trying to help her. He always hoped she'd come back someday. Margaret reached into her coat pocket and removed a worn photograph. It showed her standing beside William Whitmore decades earlier. Both of them were smiling beside a much younger herd of horses. They were good years. For several moments, nobody spoke. The room felt peaceful, almost healing. Then Sheriff Harper broke the silence. There is something else you need to know. His expression became serious again. Margaret slowly looked toward the window. I didn't lose everything because of bad luck. I was betrayed. The warmth inside the room suddenly disappeared. She turned back toward me. The people who destroyed my family believed every piece of evidence had vanished. She folded her hands together. But someone has been trying very hard to make sure you never discover the rest of my story. I felt a knot form in my stomach, because by the way she looked at me, I knew whatever truth was still hidden. It had something to do with the same people who now wanted me to stop asking questions. After hearing Margaret's story, one thing became painfully clear. She hadn't lost everything because life had been unfair. Someone had made sure she did. As I drove home that evening, I couldn't stop thinking about the names she had mentioned. Business partners, attorneys, investors. Most of them had disappeared years ago. One name hadn't. Victor Kane. Around our county, Victor was known as a successful businessman. He owned neighboring properties, invested in ranches across Texas, and seemed to have friends in every important office. People respected him. Some even admired him. But I'd spent enough years as a Texas Ranger to know something about appearances. The men who smile the easiest aren't always the ones you should trust. The following morning I started asking quiet questions, not the kind that attract attention, the kind that make people comfortable enough to remember things they had forgotten. An elderly clerk at the county records office remembered Margaret's ranch. A retired banker remembered unusual loan transfers shortly before her financial collapse. An old surveyor recalled seeing Victor meeting privately with the attorneys who handled several of Margaret's land transactions. Individually, none of those memories proved anything. Together, they painted a picture I didn't like. I spent the next 2 days buried inside county archives. Dust covered nearly every shelf. Boxes filled with property deeds, court filings, and decades-old contracts surrounded me. Most people would have given up, but investigations rarely end where they're supposed to. Sometimes they begin where everyone else stops looking. Late that afternoon, I found something unusual. A property transfer that shouldn't have existed. Margaret's signature appeared on the final page. At first glance, everything looked legal. Then I noticed something. Years earlier, while working as a ranger, I'd investigated dozens of forged land deeds. Certain mistakes always repeated themselves. This document carried one of them. Margaret had supposedly signed it on a date when county records showed she was hundreds of miles away, caring for her dying husband in a hospital. She couldn't possibly have been there. The signature wasn't merely suspicious. It was impossible. That single document led me to another, then another. Shell companies, hidden ownership records, land quietly transferred between businesses that all traced back to the same network. Victor Kane had never appeared as the official buyer. He didn't need to. He controlled the companies behind the companies. The deeper I looked, the clearer everything became. Margaret hadn't been ruined by bad investments. She had been carefully manipulated until she had no choice but to surrender nearly everything she owned. And now, history was repeating itself. Victor wasn't satisfied with stealing land decades earlier. He had already begun spreading rumors about me. According to him, I had taken advantage of an elderly woman hoping she'd reward me. People in town whispered that I'd manipulated Margaret into trusting me. Others claimed I expected to inherit part of her estate. The lies spread faster than the truth ever could. Fortunately, lies have one weakness: evidence. Before sunset, I returned to the Whitmore Ranch and shared everything I'd discovered with Eleanor and Sheriff Harper. Neither of them interrupted. When I finished, the sheriff leaned back in his chair. "If these documents are authentic—" "They are," I replied. "Then we've just reopened a case that should have been solved years ago." Margaret listened quietly from the corner of the room. She didn't seem surprised, almost as though she'd been waiting for someone to uncover the truth all along. Then she slowly reached into the pocket of her old coat. She removed a sealed envelope. The paper had yellowed with age. Across the front, written in careful handwriting, were just a few words: "For Jacob Miller." She placed it gently into my hands. "I hoped I'd never have to give you this," she said softly, "but if you're holding it, that means you've found the truth." I looked at the envelope without opening it. For reasons I couldn't explain, I already knew whatever was inside would change everything we thought we knew about Margaret and about Victor Kane. The next morning, the entire town seemed to gather inside the old courthouse. Word had spread quickly. Some people came because they remembered Margaret Dawson. Others came because they wanted to see whether the rumors about Victor Kane were true. A few came simply because in a small town, justice is never a private matter for long. The courtroom was packed. Farmers stood near the back. Business owners filled the benches. Former employees of Margaret's ranch sat quietly together. Eleanor Whitmore stood near the front with Sheriff Harper. Margaret sat beside me, wearing the same simple coat she had worn the night I found her in the rain. But this time, people were looking at her differently. Not as a homeless woman, not as someone forgotten, as someone who had been wronged. When the hearing began, Sheriff Harper presented the first documents: old property records, bank statements, hospital records proving Margaret could not have signed the transfer papers. Then came the witnesses. A retired county clerk admitted that strange pressure had been placed on his office years earlier. An old banker testified that several transactions were rushed through under unusual circumstances. A former legal assistant revealed that Victor Kane's companies had been involved in land transfers long before his name ever appeared publicly. One by one, the pieces came together. Then it was my turn. I walked to the front of the room carrying the envelope Margaret had given me. Inside were copies of letters, handwritten notes, old receipts, and a statement from her late husband describing the pressure they had faced before losing the ranch. I explained what I had found in the county archives: the impossible signature, the shell companies, the hidden ownership trail, the pattern of fraud. Every document pointed in the same direction: Victor Kane. For the first time since I'd known him, Victor didn't look confident. He sat beside his attorney with his hands folded, staring at the table as if avoiding people's eyes might make the truth disappear. It didn't. The judge reviewed the evidence quietly. The courtroom felt almost completely silent. Finally, he looked up. He ordered an immediate freeze on all remaining disputed assets connected to Margaret's former land. He ordered a formal investigation into Victor's companies. He recognized that Margaret's reputation had been damaged by fraudulent actions and stated publicly that the court record would reflect the new evidence. For a woman who had carried shame for years, those words meant more than money. Margaret lowered her head and cried. Eleanor took her hand. Several people in the courtroom cried with her. Victor was escorted out shortly after, not in handcuffs yet, but surrounded by deputies and facing charges that would likely destroy the empire he had built from other people's losses. As the courtroom emptied, Margaret turned to me. Her eyes were wet, but peaceful. "You gave me my name back," she said. I shook my head. "No, ma'am. The truth did that." Later, outside the courthouse, Eleanor told me Margaret wanted to reward me. Some of her remaining property had been protected. Several accounts would be restored. She could finally live with dignity again. I already knew what Eleanor was about to say. I smiled before she finished. "I don't want anything." Margaret looked at me. "Jacob." I shook my head gently. "You don't owe me money for doing what any decent man should have done." She studied me for a long moment, then smiled, a tired smile, but a grateful one. "Sarah raised you well." The words caught me off guard. I had never told her much about Sarah, but somehow she seemed to understand. The crowd slowly disappeared around us. The courthouse steps grew quiet. For the first time in years, Margaret Dawson stood in the middle of town without lowering her eyes. Her reputation had been restored. Her remaining land was protected. Her story had finally been heard. And I thought that was the end. Then, just before leaving, she reached for my hand. "There is one thing you can do for me." I looked at her. "Anything." She smiled softly. "Before I go." She paused. "I have one last request." The day after the hearing, Margaret asked us to meet her one last time. Not at the courthouse, not at the Whitmore Ranch, but beneath the old oak tree that overlooked the valley where William Whitmore used to bring his horses every spring. The afternoon sun was beginning to sink behind the hills when Emma and I arrived. Eleanor was already there with Noah. Margaret sat quietly on a wooden bench, watching the wind ripple across the tall Texas grass. She looked peaceful, healthier than the woman I had found beside the road weeks earlier. But more than anything, she looked at peace with herself. When we reached her, she slowly stood and smiled. "I've been thinking about that rainy night." I smiled back. "So have I." She looked directly into my eyes. "The meal you gave me wasn't what saved me." For a moment I didn't know how to respond. I had spent weeks believing that a sandwich and a blanket were all I had offered. She gently shook her head as if she could read my thoughts. "It was knowing kindness still exists." Those words settled deep inside me, because I realized she wasn't talking about food. She was talking about hope. She reached for Eleanor's hand first. "You reminded me that good people still protect what matters." Then she took my hand, "And you reminded me that goodness doesn't need an audience." Neither of us spoke. There are moments when silence says everything. Emma slowly walked toward Margaret and wrapped her small arms around her waist. "I'll miss you." Margaret smiled through tears as she hugged her back. "I'll miss you too, sweetheart." Noah stepped forward next. Without saying a word, he hugged her as well. She rested a gentle hand on each child's shoulder. "Promise me something." The two of them nodded. "When you grow up, never become too busy to notice someone who feels invisible." Emma answered first. "I promise." "So do I," Noah added. Margaret smiled one last time. I knew I came to the right place. A few days later, Sheriff Harper drove her to a quiet little cottage that overlooked a peaceful lake several counties away. Thanks to the court's decision, she had enough to live comfortably again, not with great wealth, but with dignity. Before leaving, she waved through the truck window until she disappeared around the bend in the road. I never saw her again, but somehow, I never felt as though she had really left. Life slowly returned to normal. The fences still needed repairs. The horses still demanded breakfast before sunrise. The seasons kept changing, just as they always had. One evening, Eleanor invited Emma and me to stay for supper at the Whitmore Ranch. After dinner, the four of us carried buckets of feed out to the pasture. Emma and Noah laughed as the horses crowded around them, impatient for their evening meal. The sky glowed with the deep orange colors that only a Texas sunset can paint. As I leaned against the fence watching them, I noticed movement near the front gate. An older traveler was walking along the road with a worn backpack slung over one shoulder. He looked tired, hungry. Before I could say a word, Emma quietly reached into the picnic basket we had brought outside. She pulled out the sandwich she had saved for herself. Then she ran toward the gate. She smiled at the traveler and offered it with both hands. He accepted it with grateful eyes. Emma came running back as though she had done nothing unusual. To her, she hadn't. She had simply done what she had seen all her life. I looked toward the fading horizon and found myself thinking about Sarah. Her words, her quiet wisdom, her belief that kindness always finds its way back. She had been right all along, not because kindness always returns to the person who gives it, but because it changes every heart it touches, including our own. As Eleanor slipped her hand into mine, and the children laughed among the horses, I realized that one rainy evening had given me far more than I had ever offered. I thought I was feeding a hungry stranger. I never imagined she was feeding something I'd almost forgotten. Hope. If you had seen that woman standing alone by the road, would you have stopped to help her? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about kindness, family, second chances, and cowboys who never give up, subscribe to the channel and join us for the next story.